pleasure that we can do this podcast because we know each other for quite a long time. Also, I'm wearing my T-shirt that you have
Yeah,
given me
old
from
school.
FMX. So it's great to be here. So I wanted to have just a little chat about the whole industry, also because you have also experience, and also you're part of the Substance Painter team quite a long time. So I wanted to first please introduce yourself so we can take out from there.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Laurens Corijn. I live in Belgium and I've been working for Adobe for 5 years. I actually just got a reminder. And before that, I worked for Algorithmic before they joined Adobe. And I do, well, my title is Head of Substance Learn, which means I deal with training, helping people out. I go to events sometimes. I'm responsible for a lot of the tutorials. And before that, I've always been kind of doing 3D, save for a little break. We'll talk more about that later. I worked in the games industry for Splash Damage, for Electronic Arts at DICE, and I studied and I was a teacher at the How West University in Belgium. So that's kind of my background. So I've been doing it for about, I think it's nearly 15 years now. Yeah, I'd have to count when I started exactly, but it's been a
Wow,
while.
quite a long 15 years. So how did you get into the industry?
I mean, the industry specific, I'd say it was once I graduated, I took a job as a teacher because I always liked helping people, but I felt like, especially when you're young, you want this amazing job. You think it's going to be all that. And I got in because I posted a lot online on forums. It was back on Polycount, and I posted my work, and I made a shader as well. Still, people talk to me. Just yesterday, somebody did called the Zolio shader, and on Polygon, they'd seen that, and there were two people on Polygon, Paul and Tim. They'd seen my work, and they contacted me if I wasn't interested in a job at Splash Damage, and I went over there for an interview, and that's kind of how it really got started.
Oh, that's nice. So that's your first job actually.
That was my first industry job. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could count the teaching job, but it was a good job. But I felt like true industry job was after that when I went to the UK to London.
So progressing through the whole 15 years of your experience, so you're now at Adobe, a part of the team.
Hmm.
So uh, how did you get through the whole, I will say, the whole industry? Because mostly when you're starting out into the industry, for example, it's very tough to get in. And
Yeah.
afterwards, when you do like consistent upgrade to your knowledge, also to your career, basically you came upon some tough moments. So, what were your tough moments until you get to this position?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think that what you say that getting in is always hard. I don't think that's necessarily even true for 3D. Like once you get a certain amount of experience, it's way easier to get a job because they don't take a risk on you anymore. But for me, once I did it was about 4 years in the industry when I worked at EA. That was a bit of a tough time. It was a combination of I I never was truly into the project as well. It wasn't Battlefield that we worked on at DICE. It was Mirror's Edge. Everybody always loves the first one. The second one, most people don't even know about it really. And I felt, I mean, they tried hard, but they tried something very ambitious, which the team wasn't necessarily suited for. And after that, I kind of had a bit of enough of the industry. It was a combination of personal factors as well. You know, like my girlfriend at the time, we broke up. I had to leave Sweden then because I didn't feel it worked anymore. And I kind of had this moment of I don't want to do any video game stuff at all anymore. I actually quit EA, got on my motorcycle the next day, and drove to a farm in Norway where I worked on a boat with this bunch of crazy alternative people. I was fixing tractors and working on this boat and so forth. And it took about a year before I kind of came back and wanted to do some of that stuff. I did lots of traveling, looking into myself. I think maybe people that are studying now won't recognize that, but I think a lot of people, when you're like 25, 26, you're like, I want to see the world. I want to do something with my life. I always remember stories you hear of somebody who says, I did all these crazy jobs. I was a dog walker. But they list a bunch of random jobs that they did. And back then I felt like I want to be that person too, that did all those random jobs, not necessarily forever, but just to get a taste of the world instead of I don't want to sound too negative, but instead of sitting behind a desk making video games all the time, I felt there's a whole world there. Maybe I should try it out a bit. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's, I mean, I had a good time, but it was a tough time. Like meaning wise, philosophically, you're thinking like, okay, do I want to do this? Where do I want to go? Eventually I ended up here, and I think, yeah, it's a good situation. So that's sort of my tough times that I had.
Well, it's quite a journey. Well,
Yeah.
mostly everybody like gets into that like a position and mindset and want to do relax, because sometimes the pressure and the structure on when you're working on big projects can be also energies like
Yeah.
it's going to drain you a lot. So when you're working into those big studios, basically how the whole team progress, how do you communicate? So from that side, I know that there is a lot of pressure on the deadlines because there is so much the company invested into that pipeline, so they have to get the whole game out. So mostly, how do you support each other when you're working on such a large projects?
Oh, that's a tough question, because to be honest, my experience is like really working in a big studio like that is a less than half of my experience. Most of it has been like with Adobe, which is a big company as well, or doing the teaching. So it's a bit harder to answer. I'd say the pressure for me was always kind of okay. I didn't have to crunch all that much. I didn't think it was that crazy. Usually studios are good. I think if you stand firm as well, you can avoid that. Like really like being fired because you don't do crunch, or feeling like you have to prove yourself. I don't think you necessarily have to do that. But how it works for an entire team is, how would I say that exactly? I mean, everybody's in it together. That's kind of a nice thing. You work together towards something. That kind of feeling is definitely something that I don't have all that much now in Adobe. It's all very scattered. We do something here, we do a small project there. I deal with that. I like the variation, but when you're in a studio, it's all together in the same boat, rowing a big
Yeah.
project somewhere, and that feeling is pretty cool. Together with the boys and the girls, we're going to make this work through hard times, through good times. But it also means that you're in this boat for a long time. You're going somewhere, and it can be hard to steer. I remember that was exactly what I thought of Dice. I feel like it's a big ship, and I'm only a small person, and I can barely move where it's going or what it's doing. So there's pluses and cons to both.
Well said, actually, well said. So mostly, yeah, when you're working on those projects, it's hard to maneuver for sure. So that's
And
well,
maybe one thing to add to that as well. I always, as a technical artist, because I could do 3D, I could do scripting, because you can do both. It made it for me a bit more interesting because I can switch between things. I could make an asset one day, I could work on a script another day, I could look into level performance another day, and that for me made it more interesting to work in these big companies. I couldn't, me personally, right? No offense to anybody who does that. I couldn't imagine being only making characters, only making weapons, only making levels all the time when I'm there. I need a variation, a kind of challenge to change this up. So that also makes my situation a bit unique.
yeah, for sure. It defines you as an adventurer. So
Yeah,
that's a
yeah,
good thing.
maybe.
So uh, basically, what we are focusing here at the M3DS Academy, and mostly it's about passion. So what is your passion for working in the, let's say, for example, for the teaching industry, for the current position that you're right now?
Yeah, I guess there's two things that drive me a bit. One is I'm kind of a lazy artist in a way, wherein if I figure out how to do something, that's interesting, right? It's the challenge to figure it out, to learn how to do it, to learn how to do it well. But once I figure that out, for me, the interest kind of drops away. I'm like, okay, I've done this before. It's just a rinse and repeat. I just sit there and press the buttons in the same order that I've perfected. So I like to keep finding smarter and more efficient workflows to do something. Once I figured something out, can I script it? Can I cut corners? Can I do the same thing with less effort? Are there different ways to get a better results? I'm always looking for smarter, lazier ways to work, which is kind of what drives me as a technical artist. And then I also really like helping other people out with this knowledge. I'm not the person to keep this for myself. Like my shader that I mentioned before, I gave that away for free because I figured out you could do good viewport rendering with it. Rather just give that to people. I used to make tutorials even when I was just graduated. Rather just share that knowledge with someone else because maybe it makes them faster, more efficient, gives them a better way to work. So this sort of like figuring out better ways, sharing the knowledge is kind of what I'm about. So that's my passion.
No, that's nice. And has your passion changed?
um, if I
So,
see it like that, probably not. I'd say these days I may be a bit less passionate about 3D and say because I kind of feel like I figured it out. Though we can talk more about, but it's come back with some applications and new technologies that come out. But I still look for the same sort of challenge in a lot of other things. Like I've started new hobbies, like electronics, soldering little Arduinos and things together. It's the same thing. You're figuring out something new. How can I make something more efficient? Um, so I try to do practical things as well because once you've sat behind your computer for 15 years, it is nice to do something else behind that. So I try and apply the same ideas that I have to other hobbies outside of that.
well, that's
But
quite.
sometimes I combine them though. Like right now, I'm doing woodworking and I'm using 3D and Blender with the script to help me with the woodworking. So sometimes they come together and I do both.
They combine. So that's very interesting thing that you said because when you're working, for example, some like for me personally and for our students that we're saying, you the 3D is the main thing, but you need to have hobbies. So my question is to you,
Yeah.
what you do in your free time?
Yeah, it kind of feeds into each other. It's really changed for me over the years, to be honest. That when I was younger, when I was like 25, I was really into, even when I was a kid, I had all these books with planes and cars and tanks and so forth. I was super into like vehicles and technology, and that's what I would model all the time. Back in university, people would almost make fun of me because all I did was model cars and vehicles and so forth. I was just super into it, and but it's kind of changed where I don't do that super much anymore, and I'm more interested in how do you say, yeah, the connection between the digital and the real world as well. And that's something I've got to know more with Adobe, because as you know, Substance started out being very much for entertainment, for games, for VFX, but now a big part of the business, I think probably a bigger part than the entertainment, is the things like design, product design, fashion, automotive. Car companies are using Substance to figure out materials. Fashion companies are figuring these things out, and it's really interesting to see how this 3D stuff, which my dad, when I started studying, said that's ridiculous. Why are you going to study this? You're never going to find a job. It's useful. Has so many uses in the real world outside of that, and I find that interesting.
My dad also said, "Why are you starting 3D when 4D is out?"
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, he said it's all going to be outsourced to China and India, and nobody's going to have to do that anymore. But I mean, we're like 15 years later, and there's more jobs than ever in it. So
No,
yeah,
that's nice actually because from that side, you're working also on your passion and also implementing it into your real world. So that's a very nice thing because, like I mentioned, so when you're doing like so many hours, some into 3D, for example, for new 3D artists, they call it an artistic block. Sorry, but
yeah,
actually it's more like a burnout, and they don't have
hmm,
like something to do in their free time, and their hobbies are a very crucial thing in their career.
yeah.
So you said lot of things because you have your passion has changed over time. So how the industry has evolved, because you're working basically on many things, and you definitely have some insights.
Yeah. So for the video games industry, it's a bit harder for me to answer because, to be honest, I barely play video games anymore. I watch movies and things now and then, but I probably seriously play like one game a year or something. I do stay in touch with people that work in the industry. I see things pass by on LinkedIn. I'd say the biggest observation I have is that, especially, or at least what I think is the biggest one, is in the years that I've seen it, it's just gotten way more work to create video games. When I remember some of my favorite games when I was young, was it like the Need for Speed 4, 5, Quake 3, and so forth? The people making that, you could probably list them on one page. While for the latest games, I don't know how many pages you would need, 100 or something to list all of them on there. So
It
the effort for
takes
that has scaled to a crazy amount there. So it also means that people, you just need to be more efficient because there's going to be a limit to that. You're not going to be able to make a project if you need like 50,000 people to do it, right? That's like bigger than the size of an entire company like I don't know, Activision Blizzard or whatever. So there's the change here. But I also think on the other hand, what's interesting is you get much more because of Steam and the whole self-publishing. It's way easier to get a small idea out there with indie studios and so forth. I think these days I probably would have stayed in the industry or at least done things different if I worked for smaller developers and hadn't gone for these big AAA things where you're just a small part of the equation, rather versus a smaller production where you can, be more of like a real technical artist, do a bunch of different things.
and you can steer the boat more.
Yeah, so the thing has kind of gone in two directions. Like super big productions, you've got the smaller ones as well. They're just way more prolific. So it's interesting either way. But I think both are a lot of work. So it's
Yeah, for sure. When it takes time to develop a game, like now it takes 5 or 6 years,
Mm,
and maybe you're going to release it and rush it at the end. There's so much thing. That's a very good thing that you point out because indie studios are now more popular and people are getting into those studios. And previously, like 10 or 15 years ago, it was much easier to create a game. But when you now see the industry has evolved and it's much more, let's say, for example, if it is a more realistic game or something like that, or going to see a video where the Blizzard engine was created in 2 months and now it takes decades.
yes.
So, but what do you say to those who are starting into the industry? How do they get like to achieve their job? What's the mistakes you have done so you can give them advice and how to develop their careers? Because some of them are starting out and they wanted to have a fast, successful career. So they're
Yeah.
just trying to play the short game.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, things have changed. I think the biggest difference is back when I graduated, what was considered good work then or like a good student portfolio now probably isn't good enough. But the tools have also gotten better. The learning content has also gotten better. So you definitely want to keep up with that. That's the number one thing. If you want to be an artist, at least visually, you got to meet the standards that's set online, right? So I'd say focus on that quality and not necessarily on quantity as well, because you get people doing a lot of things, but it's better to have two or three really good things. Don't spread it out too much, like somebody doing a character and an environment and a prop. I don't know, one of those three or two of those three are probably not going to be as good as the rest, so don't bother with that. Focus a bit on something to get started. There's always ways to change that later. I've seen guys that were environment artists, weapon artists, that have become character artists, for example, because that's the most difficult thing. The other thing I would say is get your work out as well. Just get it shown, post it on ArtStation. If you want to do more of a technical thing, share your scripts, share what you're figuring out. These days with Blender and so forth, it's much easier to do that, to get into. So making sure you're seen, making sure your quality's there, I think is the number one thing that you should be doing. And I guess attending industry events as well. I've done that a few times where you get to talk to, people from industries, wherever that is, could be a good step in as well. Just networking, really. If you're super shy and you're only sitting in your bedroom making things, you probably need to compensate that by being even better than the average people. Well, if you get in, have some contacts, that compensates for other things as well. So it's a balance game.
Yeah, for sure, because there is a lot of introverts these days because we have the academy and the students enrolling and they're more shy to contact somebody or attend some meetings. So that's a very good thing that you pointed out. That's networking.
Yeah.
It's even so when we saw each other in Germany, it was like a reunion. So from that side,
Yes.
it's like keeping updated with your friends into
Mhm.
the industry. So sometimes maybe it will be help you because sometimes you're going to miss something into this industry.
And
So
maybe one thing to add to that as well, because I'm just thinking of like when we met in Stuttgart as well, there were a bunch of students there. And I'm thinking back of when I was a student, you're much less confident. You feel less inclined to talk to these people that you look up to with all this experience. But to be honest, most people just want to help out. If you have a question as a student, everybody was there at one point. So there's no need to be afraid of asking a question or so forth. To be honest, the worst thing you can do as a student is to not be receptive to that kind of stuff. I've talked to students where I give them feedback and then they don't agree. They're like, no, I think it's this way. That's not very helpful. But just asking around, being open to input, being open to talking to people, honestly, if you do that with me, with you, whatever, I'm sure we just want to help. So
yeah, that's a good thing to say. So mostly they're, like I mentioned, they have a very difficult thing to network, and also nowadays it's much more easier to network because you have Discord, you have
mhm.
Google Meet or something like that. You have also virtual meetings when you're going to connect. But mostly what are the biggest mistake when they're becoming like a junior artist?
um, I'd say the one thing portfolio wise, I think a typical student portfolio has too much in it and not everything is finished. I think that's a big mistake. I'd
Very
rather
true.
see one really good thing versus 10 things of which half are gray boxed and then some of them are not good or something. Like that saying, I think it's always true. You're only as good as your worst work is very true. So don't show your worst work. You're not going to be, I mean, they're not going to say, oh, he hasn't made enough. No, they're going to say, wow, he's made one thing, but it's very good. I think that's the main thing to keep in mind as a student. And that also means that something that you worked very hard on last year, which you thought was your best work back then, but isn't now, you should be okay to throw that out. I think that's one of the things I've learned as well. You sometimes need to kill kill your darlings in a way. Need to be okay with removing something, getting rid of something. I struggled with that in my first jobs. Even I mean, I worked a bunch on like a weapon system for a game, and then after half a year, they said, "Ah, we're going to change it completely, throw it out." And that was part of the reason why I left as well, because it was a big disappointment. But in the end, as you get older, you learn to accept that. Helps as a student to get into that mindset of as well of just I'm not going to keep that. It's not good enough. I'll keep only my best or latest, or try and reapply it and be much faster in the next project. So I think that's a really important one. And I'm thinking once they're working, what the biggest mistakes would be. I'm just thinking. I have a few people in my team that were fairly junior when they started. Um, I'd say being afraid to ask for help. Like you think when you start a job that you're supposed to know everything by
Mhm.
yourself and you're afraid to ask for help, that's the worst thing you can do. When you're hired as a junior, companies, me as a manager, we fully realize that you're going to need a lot of input, but we're taking that as a chance to hope that you level up as well. So you need to take that chance as well. Don't just sit there and do something without asking and then come back at the end and be like, oh, I don't know if it's good or anything. No, just speak up and ask about it. It's the only way for everybody to get better.
Yeah, mostly you are feel free to make a lot of mistakes, but the crucial thing is that you have to learn from them.
Yep.
So when you say about the portfolio, so I mean, it's my personal question. When you started out, let's say from a cube, uh, from my perspective, I don't know. I want to see how they develop their whole portfolio. I want to see them in their, let's say, for example, their art station, and I want to keep their portfolio so we can see how they progress. So, do you think that it's very crucial to have just the best work and few items in it?
If you apply, yeah, I think so. Because I understand from a school perspective, yes, you want to see how they progress. But if I'm looking at this as somebody who's going to hire, or then because on art station, sometimes people don't put things in an order that they've created them. Often they do, but I can't look at the dates and look at everything and be like, oh, they made that 3 years ago. They're probably way better by now. Especially with students, they get better so much faster
Yes.
that it's hard to tell what happens there exactly. I would say if you want to keep these things as a progress, like a progress timeline, either create a separate portfolio for when you're applying. And I mean, I still have my old portfolio from when I was a student online just for myself to look at from what I came from. but I wouldn't necessarily show it to an employer when you're going to apply publicly to them. I mean, tons of people do like portfolios with NDA stuff as well. There's definitely ways to filter what you show.
No, that's nice. That's nice. It's a very crucial thing because we've seen that somebody, but I definitely hate the VIP, like unfinished work, and when
Yeah.
I see something like previously it was like a trend, so I can see it's just my VIP, and never got finished. So from that side, it's very crucial.
I mean, that's not to say you can't show work in progress images. I actually even like when somebody posts good work to see work in progress, how they got there, because it gives me insight in how they made that. But work in progress should never be a finished standalone thing. Don't show them unless it's finished to your standards, at least.
Yeah, that's correct. So after they get into the industry, and I'm just curious about because when you develop your skills, eventually you can work in all industries, from
Mm-hmm.
games, films, fashion, product design, automotive, a lot of things. So my question is, what's the difference between the film and the game industry? Because you have knowledge in both areas. So mostly I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious about that because somebody wants to get into the film industry, somebody wants to get into the game industry. So what do you recommend?
That's a super interesting question. I might actually answer even more than what you're asking for. So the first one, difference between film and games, I've worked only a little bit with film stuff. I'd say the biggest difference is that it's not meant for real-time rendering, so performance isn't important. You can get away with making only high poly stuff. You can get away with not being optimal, with tons of draw calls, with crazy materials that do this and that. So I'd say the requirements for the quality and the level of detail are a little bit higher. While for games, they really expect you to know how to make good low polys, how to make good bakes, how to make optimized models, how to build a level that is, have an idea about draw calls and everything. While draw calls is probably in the films industry something that doesn't matter at all to them. That said, things are starting to merge a little bit with Unreal for virtual production and so forth. And again, Unreal also lets you be a little bit sloppy with these things, that it helps to know a bit of both. So I'd say that's the biggest difference. But then when you mention other industries as well, like fashion and product design and so forth, they all have their own requirements. But I'd say a strong technical baggage these days is probably going to be beneficial everywhere. Like maybe people don't even realize this, but some cars on the dashboard are running Unreal Engine. So when you see a render of the car that spins around, some fancy cars do this. It could be Unreal Engine. It could be Unity. And this is only going to become more. So having that technical knowledge could help you get a job in these other industries as well. I mean, just recently, I saw a guy that applied at Adobe and he didn't get the job eventually. He was looking for something else, works for Renault now, car company with, he had Unity and video games knowledge. So it does translate over. And especially because they're looking for those kinds of people in those industries. I still think there's it's growing. It's a different world. People don't really overlap much there. And I think a lot of people in entertainment games have an idea that that's boring and not cool. They don't want to go there, but it could be interesting. It could be more stable. It could be paid better. It could be different challenges as well. So it's worth keeping in mind as well.
Yeah, I have somebody that I know that works into the automotive industry, and their designs are created in Autodesk Maya. I was like, why?
Yeah.
But eventually, yeah, your knowledge can be implemented mostly everywhere because you have a strong potential in working for, let's say, for automotive now. Even the big companies like Apple and Meta are going into the VR
Yes.
industry. But mostly, when I have a thought that in the future we are going to probably not watch movies so much. Instead, we're going to play them because the graphics are getting much more realistic. So, what's
Yeah.
your thought on that?
I mean, that's an interesting one. I'm trying to think if I've ever had an experience like that. There was this, I forgot the name. It was on Netflix. It was like an interactive thing. You could click,
Yes.
which I forget the name. It was. Do you remember what it was called? It was like
Yeah.
this sort of horror-ish thing, and you could. And I tried to play all the endings. It was very interesting. I quite liked it. So that kind of stuff, yeah, it might happen, especially when you've got like cloud streaming like Google Stadia. It's
Something
not
like
there anymore.
Mirror was called. I
Yeah, it
think.
was something like that. I forget the name. So yeah, I find it hard to answer, but one thing I know for sure is that the line between real time and offline rendering, so like V-Ray sort of rendering, it's blurring more and more, and it's going to end up being mostly real time. I mean, everybody's seen it. Like RTX ray tracing in Unreal Engine can look really, really amazing, and that's only going to become better and faster these days. So
So what's hold the future? So what's your thought on that? Because basically, my point of view is like I think that it's going to be becomes more interactive, and the cinema is just getting older. But how do you think this industry is going to progress on that side? Because you said
oh,
that we've seen cars that maybe are rendering in Unreal Engine or Unity their dashboard. But what do you think is going to like involve more?
wow, that's a really big question. I don't know if I can answer that properly. I mean, we've talked about like AAA games being a lot of work. I don't think that can go on forever. There might be a bubble at some point where, the so many of Call of Duty people might get tired of it eventually. Then again, they might not. I don't know. I'm tired of it. I don't play it anymore, but
Yeah.
it still sells a lot, so people are into it. There's a lot of interesting indie games as well. So who knows that that's going to become even more. I mean, look at what the numbers that some of them are doing on Steam. I'm thinking of Stardew Valley, for example. I mean, this guy's like a multimillionaire from making something by himself. That's also a possibility. Um, so where it's going to go exactly, I don't know. It's probably going to be things running next to each other. You might get movies that become more interactive, AAA games that are still there, and indie things. I don't think there's one call I can make there. But one thing I'll say for sure, there's definitely a lot of opportunities there in every way. As long as you're open to it and you don't hyper focus on one single thing. Because the one thing I still remember is when I was a student, everybody wanted to work for Blizzard. A lot of
Yeah.
people that I knew back then, they actually did work for Blizzard. Most of them don't work there anymore because company isn't what they imagined it to be anymore. So if you're open to many things in your future as someone that's starting out, you might end up somewhere which you never expected, but turns out pretty good.
Yeah, that's a true key point on that side because everybody has some like a sort of a like goal to get into the industry, and mostly that's also one thing that I'm thinking about. So when somebody is like creating and developing, we're going to get back to the portfolio. So somebody that is developing their portfolio. So my advice to them was like, if you want to work for Blizzard or some sort of like company, you should develop your like artwork based on
Yeah.
their works. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad thing. If you want to get into a certain thing, it always helps to have work that's aligned with what this company is doing. It's definitely not a bad thing, especially if you nail it. It shows that you can not only follow an art direction, but figure out an art direction, which is not
Yeah,
easy. So, I mean, following an art direction, just making something for a concept, that's one thing, sticking close to it. But if you can make something that's not a direct concept, but by discerning the things that make sense, like, okay, they have, muted colors, they have specific shape language, especially for Blizzard, you see juniors that get into that and they figured it out. They can make a model that's not a direct copy of a concept that they've kind of come up themselves by kid bashing in their heads an idea. Yeah, that's a good thing to do. That said, my only advice would be, how they say, like, if you meet your heroes, it might not be as amazing as you think it is. Don't focus too much on ending up in one place or another, especially your first jobs. You probably change like every year or two or something, so see where you end up.
well, that's a very good because you've mentioned that you have to also not just copy it, but to involve. But from my side, like because you and me were like educators,
Hmm.
so what's the best thing for them to get involved, like to involve? Sorry, because when they get a job, they just sign out and they don't create a portfolio. Like they just partying and everything, and eventually when some sort of like a job cuts happen, they start to work on the portfolio.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't think there's this weird point. I mentioned this before, where you switch over from you're doing it based purely on your portfolio to where it moves over, you're doing it on experience. Once I got to a certain point in my career, I also felt like they were asking me to do art tests, for example. I pushed back. I said, I don't have time for this. And some of them, like for Dice, for example, wasn't even that far in my career. I had 4 years of experience. I said I didn't want to do it, and because I knew a guy who vouched for me, I didn't have to. I didn't have to make that specifically. So you get to this weird point where all of a sudden they believe that you're good enough because someone else has vetted you. Yeah, that could be the case. That said, you probably always have something to show from an employer that you worked at. And so maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but some of them don't let you take home anything of your work, but it still helps to have a few screenshots to still safeguard some of your work. I remember from my first job, I probably copied like all the assets over that I made, which I wasn't supposed to do, I bet, but I still have them somewhere just in case I would have to show. So make sure you have something to show, because there are rare cases where people, jobs get cut and they have nothing to show for it. That might be, and the project was canceled and never released and so forth. That's a bad situation to be in. So you want to
That's the
avoid that.
main thing that I'm fighting for right now. I'm speaking with everybody, but basically, even so, to actor happens the same thing, because they're going to go to the movie, do some short scenes, and they will be cut by the director. So
Mhm.
mostly everybody is like, if you try to get to the big studio, expect that you're not going to show your work for maybe up to 5 or 6 years.
It's true that probably half of your stuff might not even get shown. So, but you can still do this thing where you have a portfolio that's separate, only accessible with a password. I mean, if you follow all the legal terms, you're probably still not allowed to show that anyway. But I mean,
Yeah, it's not
they're never,
publicly, so I
if they
think,
never find out, it's never going to be enforced. So I wouldn't worry about that too much, that kind of thing.
yeah, that's the thing that, so mostly for movies, okay, that you have spoilers and it's not good to be shown, but
But even
mostly,
for games, you could have that, right? I mean, they're getting better with it. Just now, there was I think it was Phoenix Lab, and they killed some kind of dragon project. And then all of a sudden, all the people that worked on that, and some of them were fired even, they were allowed to show their work. So I think maybe in general, the industry seems to be getting a bit better about that kind of stuff. But you never know. Some companies are just tougher than others on that. They have like really strict legal terms. They'll do things like they'll block USB ports on computers and so forth. Yeah, I mean, I'm not telling people to go into that, but it's just something to keep in mind, that you always have something that you ask for if there's a way to show it and so forth. There might be. They're just playing it safe, but if you ask for it and check for it, there might be a way for you to get something to show eventually.
yeah, mostly that's the most bad side. I think that can change, because mostly artists, when they're having to develop the the work on the project, so mostly they wanted to get to share with their colleagues in order to get good comments, mostly to
Hmm.
get that good dopamine, because you have worked so
Yes.
hard on it, and sometimes you do a lot of overtime on those projects. Yeah, definitely. So we do not suggest that you like take a screenshot, but it's first thing you have to ask. But if they don't let you, it's a good thing to have something
To have
like a
something in mind.
backup.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I
Yeah. Yeah.
thought the same thing. So
Yeah. 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 I mean, I think if you ask a lot of people, maybe it's because I'm so far removed from the industry that I feel okay saying that. But I bet there's a lot of people that do this kind of stuff. So yeah.
yeah, because they don't have also the time to develop their own portfolio when they're doing
Mhm.
overtime. So mostly when you go back from work, I'm just trying to get to my bed.
Yeah. And that said, though, maybe some tips I would have for, because that's something I realized as well much later in my career, is if you do have to make something from scratch, it doesn't have to be perfect, perfect. It doesn't have to be the perfect high poly, the perfect low poly, the perfect bakes, the perfect UVs. No, if you make something that, for example, shows that you can texture really well, but the low poly isn't great and the UVs are only a quick automatic thing in Substance Painter, that's good too. It shows that you know how to do this, for example. I would focus on, because in the end, very simply, people are going to look at a thumbnail and at the first image. That's what you're going to be based on. And that could be, just throwing a number out there, only 30% of the work compared to doing all that perfect low poly, perfect high poly, perfect UV, and so forth. So you could cheat a bit and skip some time on that. So that's one way to get your portfolio out there quicker. I'm not saying for students to do this, but if you're in a pinch for time and so forth, or if your only piece is like a hacky thing where only certain parts are good, yeah, probably think about it twice. But if you want to make something, there's ways around that. This is how I make a lot of the artwork that I post these days. I mean, I use Substance 3D Modeler, which is it's like a voxel sculpting tool. So you don't think about topology. It's really nice. You can make something quick. You just combine shapes. And when you export it, it auto retopologizes and auto UVs, which is, I mean, it's not perfect. It's like at best 50, 60% of what I would do myself quality wise, but it gets you something out there. And I can spend time on the stuff I really like doing, like texturing and lighting and rendering, instead of, all this technical stuff, which I know how to do. And I have other projects that show this, but I don't want to do it for every project because it just takes so much time.
Yeah, for sure, because you're like, that's a very good thing to say, because you're like training your creative side, because when you're doing like a very good character, and when you see the zebra sculpt is very nice, and afterwards when you go to UVs or topology and those stuff, I think they're the passion killer at some point.
They're a barrier to creativity. Yeah, it's like you're on a creative roll, you're running along, you're flying, and then all of a sudden there's this like crazy wall that you have to get over or something, and it stops you in your flow kind of state. That's not to say I hate all of it to do it. Sometimes it's nice to do UVs, but it's definitely this thing where from the concept high poly thing where you don't have to care about all of that stuff, all of a sudden you have to do all this technical stuff to then move on. Thank God these days there's like auto retopo, auto UVs, and so forth. I mean, it's not necessarily cheating using that, as long as you're upfront about it and you make sure you compensate in other areas. Why not just do it that way? I definitely let go of this thing. Because I felt like when I would post my work, I didn't post 3D work for probably 5 years. Like when I got a job, like you said, you stop making stuff, you do a little bit less of it, and then I got into this thing like, oh, I don't care about the industry. I just didn't do anything about that anymore. And then because I was thinking, if I'm going to post something, all my artist peers are going to judge me. They're going to see like, oh, bad low poly, bad this and that. You know what? No, in the end, just stop caring about that. They'll see that's a nice image in the end. And if you want, you can say I could do it, but I didn't care about the UVs. And sometimes you can make a project that does have perfect UVs. So it doesn't always have to be 100% perfect.
Yeah, I've seen that you're pretty active now on LinkedIn, that you
Yeah, a little bit more.
Yeah, that's very nice to see a lot of creative stuff. Like we tried also the modeler. It's very nice for beginner stuff and somebody to get encouraged, because when you're starting in the industry, all of your stuff are going to be very poor. Like
Yeah.
And it's quite good that you said that you have to be up to standards. So it's going to be a difficult question, but what kind of a standard do we need to follow?
A study. Well, I mean,
Standard for 3D artists on the game like side, because mostly we are into the game industry, and we've seen a lot of our station stuff. So somebody is not finished the work, or somebody is using like a Photoshop to like put a makeup on it. So how do we follow like a?
So I think it's a good question. I'm thinking of student portfolios and then things that I've seen recently. The last thing I made was like a 1970s radio. When I was looking for that, I found a few people that made the same radio. And what you see is technically they do it okay. Like, they make a low poly, they make a high poly, they do the texture. Texture's okay. But in the end, visually, it falls a bit flat because there's certain aesthetics things that they ignore. And I would say everybody can learn the technical thing. When you're making good UVs, making good low polys, those are all rules that you just follow, right? And anybody can learn that. Even my mom, your grandpa, if you just get them the rules and they spend enough time with the tools, they can learn that. But where you stand out as an artist is with that visual quality, to actually make it visually appealing. And that starts at the very beginning, even with your model, with the proportions. So thinking back of when I made cars, if you're making cars and you look very closely, you see that even the boxiest 1980s Toyota that you can think of, it's not a box. It's got like nice curves. It's flowing. If you look at it from an angle, there's a line that does a specific thing. Those are the kind of things that you want to pick up on as an artist. I'm saying cars on one hand, but if you think of Blizzard characters on the other hand, you could have a Blizzard character, it kind of looks like it, but the proportions are off a bit. The chunkiness is missing. Some of the details are not there. So you want to think about that stuff from the start, and it continues on to the textures. A lot of people, a typical student texture, I'm thinking, is too dark, too grungy, too contrasted, and not interesting enough when you look at it. Goes further to the lighting. People will do like a very basic lighting that's not super interesting. While these days, lots of good tools to do lighting, lots of easy render engines with Marmoset, plenty of examples. So you want to make sure you get that artistic, aesthetic stuff down really well, where your stuff just looks good. Even if maybe technically it's not 100% perfect, it just always has to look good.
Yes, actually, everybody's like focusing on the whole technical stuff, and when they got with texturing and everything, they forget about the render. But the render is the most crucial part of the whole portfolio because we have seen so many like bed renderers, but when you see the sculpts and the textures, it's like amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I get it. If you're a student, it's just a lot. You have to learn so many difficult technical things at first. Like it just feels like an avalanche. So you feel like if I just check that off, it's good enough. But it's about the aesthetics and how it's shown. And that's where getting feedback online, that's where researching, talking to peers, talking to professionals to get feedback can all help to help improve with that.
That's very nice. So I think that I don't have any questions left for mostly
Sure.
for the students part because uh, you have given so much because you have seen the juniors how to develop and also, but let's say for maybe for last question after they get to the senior position, what is
Mm-hmm.
there the most crucial thing that you see?
I think maybe my tinted answer is, for me personally, is make sure that you stay passionate enough about it. Don't keep going doing something that you like less and less. So that means either staying in a job that's not interesting or doing a profession or doing a specific task that you're not into. I personally would think that learning new things, expanding, is what gives you a potential to grow. That doesn't mean that you have to become a manager or something, but and it could also be that you're someone who's totally fine starting as a junior weapon artist to do that for 20-25 years to become the most ultimate pro. That's fine. If you're happy with that, great. But make sure that you don't end up in a position where you're like, okay, this isn't my thing. Like I'm thinking back about Ben, this guy that I worked at in my first job who was doing weapons, who learned to become a character artist and then started doing that eventually. So if that is what it takes, then you should do that. Don't get stuck in something, I'd say.
Yes, mostly they start at junior position, senior, then lead, and afterwards they become a manager.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you don't have to do that. Like I think some companies are pretty good with that, where you can either become a manager or you can just become a senior principal. They have terms for it where you don't have to manage anybody, but just very, very good at what you do.
That's nice. So, do you want to end up and wrap this thing up with some like a good quote or good advice for the young the youngsters that are starting because they're just saying things like job layoffs and everything else, but the whole industry, mostly every industry is now like going to the bottom, but eventually they're going to get out. And I've seen a lot of like there are a lot of scarcity going on around now, but mostly eventually it's going to be recovered. But what's your main advice for that for people that are
Main
scared?
advice there: stay passionate about it. Find something that you really want to do. Make sure that it just looks really good what you're doing, which these days is, the requirements are higher. Like I said, it's easier than ever. There's so many good tutorials and then advice that you can get online. And if you do that, I think you would end up okay. If you're passionate about it, you're good, and the quality you put out, you should end up all right. And that said, also I will add, don't be afraid to look at other industries. It doesn't have to be games necessarily. It could be that, fashion, product design, they're looking for somebody there. Even if you're some hardcore crazy guy making materials and designer, there's companies that are looking for that exact kind of thing that you wouldn't think of straight away. Clothes companies, shoes companies, they might be able to use you like that. So keep an open mind for it. Maybe a tip there. There's my coworker Michael Tanzillo. He has a newsletter where he highlights 3D jobs in non-entertainment industries. It's interesting to see. You see other things that are happening there. So
Wow, I will check that out. Really, that's a
yeah.
very good ending. like code, because nobody is like wanted to like shift from the game industry, but mostly you can find some interesting stuff alongside of that. But
Mhm.
thank you very much for being on the podcast, and thank you for supporting the M3DS Academy and sharing your 15 years of experience and giving motivation to everybody. So it's a pleasure to have you.
You're welcome. Thank you.